Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Smuggling at its core represents the clandestine movement of goods across borders to evade taxes, duties, or prohibitions. In the medieval period, it emerged not as a distinct criminal enterprise from the outset, but rather as a natural response to the gradual development of regulated trade and taxation. Before the 12th century, English society was substantially self-supporting, with cross-border trade so insignificant that it rarely attracted official attention. As one historian notes, since trade was unregulated, the smuggler as a character didn't really exist. The very concept of smuggling could only come into being once authorities established borders, restrictions, and taxes on goods. The birth of medieval smuggling, therefore, coincided with the growth of international trade, particularly with continental Europe, and the simultaneous development of customs systems designed to generate revenue from this commerce. The earliest documented instances of organized smuggling in medieval England date to the 13th century, coinciding with Edward I's establishment of the customs service. This royal initiative provided the apparatus for tax collection in the form of customs houses at key ports around the coast. However, with just 13 official ports initially designated for the entire English coastline, the system immediately created both the incentive and opportunity for illicit trade at unregulated locations. What makes medieval smuggling particularly fascinating is its ambiguous moral and legal status. Unlike many other crimes of the period, smuggling existed in a gray area between legitimate commerce and outright criminality. In many communities, particularly those along the coast where smuggling thrived, it was often perceived less as a crime and more as a natural extension of trade, a necessary adaptation to burdensome taxation imposed by distant authorities. The smuggler of the medieval period was not necessarily viewed as a criminal by local communities, but rather as an economic actor responding to market demands and opportunities. This perception was particularly strong when smuggling involved the export of locally produced goods like wool, where restrictions were seen as harmful to regional economies and livelihoods. Indeed, many smugglers were otherwise respectable merchants, farmers, or fishermen, simply seeking to maximize their profits in the face of what they considered unjust restrictions. As royal governments across Europe sought to assert greater control over trade, both for revenue generation and for political purposes, the conditions that fostered smuggling became more prevalent. The tension between centralized authority and local economic interests created an environment in which smuggling could flourish, not merely as a criminal enterprise, but as a form of economic resistance. This fundamental tension would characterize the phenomenon of smuggling throughout the medieval period and beyond. The development of medieval smuggling was not simply a story of criminals versus authorities, but rather a complex negotiation between central power, local interests, economic necessity, and developing concepts of legality. It represented one of the earliest examples of what we might now call a shadow economy, an underground market that operated parallel to and often in conjunction with legitimate commerce. To understand the prevalence and nature of medieval smuggling, we must first examine the broader socioeconomic context in which it flourished. The medieval economy was fundamentally different from our modern economic systems, characterized by localized production, limited transportation options, rigid social hierarchies, and significant regional variations in wealth and resources. The period from approximately 1000 to 1500 CE saw dramatic changes in European economic organization. The early medieval period was dominated by subsistence agriculture and limited trade, but by the High Middle Ages, c. 1000 to 1300, Europe had entered a period of significant economic growth, urbanization, and commercial expansion. Trade routes expanded, new markets developed, and specialized production centers emerged. This commercial revolution created new opportunities for both legitimate and illicit trade. The growth of towns and cities generated increased demand for goods of all kinds, from necessities to luxuries. Urban centers required food, fuel, raw materials for crafts and construction, and finished products to satisfy the growing consumer appetites of townspeople. This demand, coupled with improved transportation networks and shipping technologies, facilitated the movement of goods across greater distances than had previously been practical. However, this economic growth occurred within a fragmented political landscape. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of competing jurisdictions: kingdoms, principalities, duchies, free cities, ecclesiastical territories, each with its own laws, currencies, weights and measures, and customs requirements. A merchant traveling from Florence to London might cross dozens of borders, each imposing its own taxes, tolls, and restrictions. This fragmentation created both impediments to legitimate trade and opportunities for smugglers who could navigate these complexities. The medieval economy was also characterized by significant regulation at multiple levels. Guilds regulated production in towns, dictating who could produce what goods, in what quantities, and at what prices. Municipal authorities imposed additional regulations on markets and trade. At higher levels, lords, kings, and other rulers sought to control and tax commerce within their territories. The church, too, played a regulatory role, prohibiting certain types of trade, such as usury, and imposing its own taxes. This regulatory environment created significant transaction costs for legitimate traders. Merchants had to navigate complex and often contradictory rules, pay multiple taxes and tolls, obtain various permissions and licenses, and submit to inspections and quality controls. These costs incentivized smuggling as a way to bypass burdensome regulations and reduce expenses. The medieval period also saw the development of more sophisticated fiscal systems, as rulers sought to finance increasingly expensive military campaigns, administrative bureaucracies, and court expenditures. Customs duties became a crucial source of revenue, especially for maritime states with extensive coastlines. In England, for example, the wool custom became the single most important source of royal revenue by the late 13th century, providing as much as 1/3 of the crown's income in some years. As taxation increased, so too did the incentive to evade it. When the English crown dramatically raised taxes on wool exports in the 1330s and 1340s to finance the early campaigns of the Hundred Years' War, smuggling activity increased correspondingly. Taxation levels could be extremely high, in some cases amounting to 30 to 40% of the value of the goods, making smuggling not merely profitable, but sometimes necessary for traders to remain competitive. Social inequality also played a significant role in the context of medieval smuggling. While the early medieval period had been characterized by a relatively simple division between nobles, clergy, and peasants, the later medieval economy produced more complex social stratification. Wealthy merchants, guild masters, and urban patricians formed a proto-middle class with significant economic power, but often limited political influence. At the same time, many rural producers, such as wool growers and small-scale artisans, struggled to maintain their livelihoods in the face of increasing competition and taxation. This social complexity created both the networks and the motivations for smuggling activities. Wealthy merchants might finance smuggling operations while maintaining an appearance of respectability. rural producers might turn to smuggling to secure better prices for their goods. Poor fishermen and sailors could supplement their meager incomes by participating in smuggling runs. Even members of the nobility sometimes engaged in or protected smuggling activities when it served their economic interests or allowed them to challenge royal authority. The geographical context also proved crucial for smuggling operations. Coastal regions with complex shorelines, numerous small harbors, and offshore islands provided ideal conditions for evading customs officials. Areas where different political jurisdictions met, such as the border regions between England and Scotland or the complex frontiers of the Low Countries, created opportunities for smugglers to exploit differences in taxation and regulation. Finally, the technological context cannot be overlooked. Medieval transportation was primarily based on sail power for maritime travel and animal power for land transport. While this limited the volume and speed of trade compared to later periods, it also limited the ability of authorities to effectively patrol borders and coastlines. A small fishing boat could easily land contraband on an isolated beach at night, and customs officials relying on similar technologies faced significant challenges in detecting and interdicting such activities. This complex socioeconomic context, characterized by commercial growth, political fragmentation, increasing regulation and taxation, social stratification, and geographical and technological constraints, created both the opportunities and the motivations for smuggling to flourish throughout the medieval period. Understanding this context is essential for comprehending why smuggling became such a significant aspect of the medieval economy, especially in coastal regions and border areas. The concept of the moral economy provides a crucial framework for understanding how medieval people perceived smuggling. Coined by historian E.P. Thompson to describe popular economic ethics in 18th century England, the idea has been usefully applied to earlier periods as well. In essence, the moral economy represents the social consensus about fair economic practices, what constitutes just prices, reasonable taxation, and legitimate commercial activities. In medieval society, economic activities were deeply embedded within moral and religious frameworks. The church exerted significant influence over economic thinking, promoting concepts such as the just price and prohibitions against usury. Local communities also maintained strong traditions regarding fair economic practices, often rooted in customary law and collective memory, rather than written statutes. Within this moral economy, smuggling occupied an ambiguous position. While technically illegal according to royal or princely law, smuggling activities often enjoyed significant popular support and were not necessarily considered immoral by local standards. This discrepancy between official legality and community morality created a space in which smuggling could flourish with local complicity. Several aspects of the medieval moral economy contributed to the ambiguous status of smuggling. First, there was a widespread belief that economic regulations should serve the common good rather than merely enriching rulers. When taxes and trade restrictions were perceived as excessive or serving only the interests of distant elites, evading them could be seen as morally justified. As one medieval English chronicler commented regarding wool export restrictions, "These laws serve not God nor the realm, but only fill the king's coffers while emptying those of honest men." Second, the moral economy emphasized the importance of subsistence and survival. When smuggling activities helped communities survive economic hardships by providing access to essential goods or income, they could be justified as necessary for community welfare. Wool producers in 14th century England, faced with depressed domestic prices and restrictive export regulations, often turned to smuggling to maintain their livelihoods. From their perspective, this was an act of economic survival rather than criminality. Third, medieval communities often distinguished between good and bad smuggling based on who benefited and who was harmed. Smuggling that supported local livelihoods and challenged what were seen as unjust impositions by distant authorities might be viewed positively. In contrast, smuggling that enriched outsiders at the expense of the community might be condemned. This distinction explains why local communities often protected their smugglers, while sometimes informing on outsiders engaged in similar activities. Fourth, the medieval moral economy incorporated strong concepts of reciprocal obligations between rulers and subjects. Rulers were expected to provide protection, justice, and good governance in exchange for taxes and obedience. When rulers were perceived as failing in these obligations, particularly during periods of war, famine, or economic disruption, subjects might feel morally justified in withholding compliance with what they viewed as unjust demands, including customs duties. The tension between royal law and local moral economies was particularly evident in how communities responded to anti-smuggling enforcement efforts. Local juries frequently refused to convict accused smugglers. Witnesses mysteriously failed to remember incriminating details, and communities collectively protected smugglers from authorities. As one frustrated English customs official complained in 1347, "The people of the coast are all of one sort, and will give no evidence against each other in matters of customs evasion." Religious authorities, too, often maintained an ambivalent attitude towards smuggling. While official church doctrine condemned lawbreaking, local priests might be reluctant to condemn practices that supported their parishioners' livelihoods. Some priests even participated directly in smuggling activities or provided religious spaces as secure storage for contraband. Churches near the coast sometimes served dual purposes as places of worship and temporary warehouses for smuggled goods. The moral economy surrounding smuggling was not static, but evolved in response to changing economic and political circumstances. As central authorities became more effective at enforcing customs regulations in the later medieval period, community attitudes began to shift. What had once been seen as legitimate economic activity gradually became more clearly defined as criminal behavior, though this process was neither uniform nor complete by the end of the medieval period. This tension between official legality and communal morality makes medieval smuggling a fascinating lens through which to view broader questions about the relationship between central authority and local autonomy, between written law and customary practice, and between elite and popular conceptions of economic justice. The ambiguous moral status of smuggling reflects the complex and contested nature of state formation and economic regulation in the medieval period. For many medieval communities, particularly those in coastal regions, smuggling was not simply an economic crime, but part of a broader struggle over who had the right to control economic resources and set the rules of commerce. This dimension helps explain why smuggling persisted despite increasingly sophisticated enforcement efforts. It was sustained not merely by profit motives, but by deeply held convictions about economic justice and community rights. Medieval smuggling encompassed a diverse array of commodities, reflecting both the economic priorities of the era and the specific taxation and regulatory policies that made certain goods particularly profitable to smuggle. While the nature of smuggled goods varied by region and period, several categories consistently dominated the illicit trade networks of medieval Europe. By far the most significant smuggled commodity in medieval England was wool, which represented the backbone of the English medieval economy. England's climate and topography were exceptionally well suited to sheep farming, producing wool of a quality unmatched elsewhere in Europe. This wool was in high demand in the textile centers of Flanders and Italy, where it was transformed into high-quality cloth. The economic importance of wool made it an obvious target for royal taxation. The English crown began imposing export duties on wool in the late 13th century, but it was in the 14th century that taxation reached levels that made smuggling irresistible. During the early phases of the Hundred Years' War, King Edward III dramatically increased wool export taxes to finance his military campaigns against France. By the late 1330s, these taxes had effectively reached an ad valorem rate exceeding 30% of the wool's value. These punitive taxation levels created a thriving smuggling trade, particularly from England's southern and eastern coasts. Wool smugglers in Kent, known as owlers, supposedly because they operated at night like owls, developed sophisticated operations to move wool across the Channel to Flanders. One contemporary estimate suggested that as much as 120,000 packs of wool were being smuggled annually from England during the late 17th century, and similar scales of operation likely existed in earlier periods. Beyond raw wool, finished textiles also featured prominently in smuggling operations. Luxurious fabrics like silk, damask, and fine linens were often subject to import duties or sumptuary laws restricting their use to certain social classes. Smuggled textiles allowed merchants to avoid these duties and enabled a broader segment of the population to access luxury fabrics prohibited by sumptuary legislation. Wine was another consistently important smuggled commodity throughout the medieval period. While wine was produced locally in some regions of Europe, the most highly valued wines came from specific regions, particularly France, Spain, and parts of Italy and Germany. The trade in wine was substantial, with England alone importing thousands of tons annually by the 14th century. Wine imports were subject to various taxes, including the presage, the crown's right to take a portion of imported wine, and later the butlerage, a money payment in lieu of presage, and the tonnage, a parliamentary grant to the king on each ton of wine imported. These taxes, combined with other local duties and regulations, made wine smuggling highly profitable. Smuggled wine entered England and other northern European countries through numerous small harbors and landing places, often at night to avoid detection. Sometimes legitimate wine merchants would declare only a portion of their cargo, concealing the rest to avoid full taxation. In other cases, specialized smugglers would transport wine directly from French ports to unauthorized landing places along the English coast. Spirits, though less common than wine in the medieval period, became increasingly important smuggled commodities in the later medieval and early modern eras. As distillation techniques improved, and spirits like brandy and aquavitae became more widely consumed, they too became targets for taxation and consequently for smugglers. Spices represented some of the most valuable commodities in medieval Europe, and were consequently highly taxed. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and other exotic spices from Asia reached Europe via complex trade networks, typically entering through Mediterranean ports like Venice and Genoa before being distributed throughout the continent. The high value-to-weight ratio of spices made them ideal smuggling commodities. A small pouch of pepper or saffron could be worth a small fortune, making concealment relatively easy and the potential profits enormous. Spice smuggling often involved sophisticated networks connecting Asian suppliers through Middle Eastern intermediaries to European distributors, with smuggling occurring at multiple points along these supply chains. Beyond spices, other luxury foodstuffs like dried fruits, sugar, and exotic nuts were also frequently smuggled. As with spices, these goods combined high value with relatively small size, making them attractive to smugglers. Additionally, these luxury foods were often subject to import duties, specifically designed to tax the consumption habits of the wealthy, creating strong incentives for evasion. Precious metals, particularly silver and gold, were subject to strict export controls in many medieval kingdoms. These controls were motivated by monetary policies aimed at maintaining an adequate supply of bullion for coinage. In England, for example, the export of silver and gold without royal license was prohibited throughout much of the medieval period. Despite these prohibitions, substantial amounts of precious metals were smuggled out of England and other realms. Merchants engaged in international trade often found it necessary to export bullion to balance their accounts, particularly when trading with regions that produced few goods desired in European markets. Italian merchants operating in England were frequently accused of smuggling silver and gold back to Italy against royal prohibitions. Other valuable minerals, such as tin from Cornwall and lead from Derbyshire, were also subject to export duties and correspondingly featured in smuggling operations. Tin was particularly important as Cornwall produced much of Europe's supply of this crucial component of bronze. Basic foodstuffs, particularly grain, became targets for smugglers during times of scarcity. Many medieval governments imposed export bans on grain during famines or poor harvests to ensure domestic food security. However, price differentials between regions experiencing different harvest conditions created strong incentives for merchants to evade these prohibitions. Grain smuggling was particularly common in coastal regions, where small boats could easily transport wheat, barley, or rye to neighboring territories, willing to pay premium prices during shortages. This type of smuggling was often viewed particularly harshly by authorities and local populations alike, as it was seen as profiteering from hunger rather than as legitimate economic activity. Various luxury items were occasionally prohibited entirely, rather than merely taxed, for religious, moral, or economic reasons. During times of conflict with Islamic powers, trade with Muslim territories might be banned by papal decree, creating smuggling opportunities for those willing to risk ecclesiastical censure. Similarly, goods associated with immoral activities, such as certain types of gambling equipment, or items associated with non-Christian religious practices, might be prohibited and consequently smuggled. Sumptuary laws, which restricted the consumption of certain luxury goods to particular social classes, also created opportunities for smuggling. When specific fabrics, furs, or adornments were legally restricted to the nobility, merchants could profit by smuggling these items to wealthy commoners willing to pay premium prices to emulate their social betters. In the later medieval period, particularly after the advent of printing in the mid-15th century, books and other written materials became targets for both censorship and taxation. Religious texts deemed heretical, political tracts considered seditious, or scientific works challenging established doctrines might be prohibited, creating a market for smuggled literature. While book smuggling would become more significant in the early modern period following the Reformation, there is evidence of illicit trade in controversial manuscripts even in earlier periods. Texts associated with heterodox religious movements, such as the Lollards in England or various millenarian groups on the continent, circulated through underground networks that evaded both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The specific mix of smuggled goods varied significantly across time and space, responding to changing patterns of taxation, regulation, and enforcement. When authorities cracked down on one type of smuggling, operations often shifted to other commodities or routes. Similarly, changes in tax rates or regulatory approaches could quickly transform a legitimate trade into a smuggling opportunity, or vice versa. What remained constant was the economic logic underlying smuggling. Goods moved illicitly when the potential profits from evading taxes and regulations outweighed the risks and costs of detection and punishment. This calculus was influenced not only by official policies, but also by geographical factors, technological capabilities, social networks, and cultural attitudes towards smuggling activities. The diversity of smuggled goods reflected the complex economic landscape of medieval Europe, with its patchwork of jurisdictions, variable taxation regimes, and evolving commercial networks. By examining the full range of smuggled commodities, we gain insight not only into the underground economy, but also into the broader economic priorities, regulatory approaches, and consumption patterns of medieval society. The geography of medieval smuggling was shaped by a complex interplay of physical features, political boundaries, economic incentives, and enforcement capabilities. Successful smuggling operations required intimate knowledge of terrain, weather patterns, patrol schedules, and local power structures. This section explores the primary routes and networks that facilitated illicit trade throughout medieval Europe. The coastlines of medieval Europe provided ideal conditions for smuggling operations. The rugged, indented shorelines of regions like Cornwall, Brittany, and parts of the Mediterranean offered countless small coves, inlets, and natural harbors where goods could be landed away from official ports and the watchful eyes of customs officials. These geographical features, combined with the limitations of medieval surveillance technology, made coastal smuggling extremely difficult to prevent. Maritime smuggling typically involved smaller vessels that could navigate shallow waters and beach directly on shores without requiring port facilities. Fishing boats were particularly well suited for smuggling activities, as they provided legitimate cover for movement at sea and could access small landing places inaccessible to larger trading vessels. Fishermen, with their detailed knowledge of local waters, tides, and weather patterns, often supplemented their incomes by participating in smuggling operations. Key maritime smuggling routes connected England's southern coast with northern France and the Low Countries, particularly focusing on the wool trade. A well-established route ran from the Kent and Sussex coasts to Calais, Boulogne, and other French ports, while another connected East Anglia to the ports of the Low Countries, especially Antwerp and later Amsterdam. These short crossings could be completed in a single night under favorable conditions, allowing smugglers to depart after dark and return before dawn. In the Mediterranean, smuggling routes often followed the coastlines, with goods moving between various political jurisdictions to exploit differences in taxation and regulation. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa maintained extensive maritime networks that facilitated both legitimate trade and smuggling throughout the Mediterranean basin. Islands like Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica served as important way stations in these networks, offering safe harbors and storage facilities for contraband goods. The Baltic Sea represented another major arena for maritime smuggling, with the Hanseatic League dominating both legitimate and illicit trade. Smuggling operations connected the coasts of modern-day Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and Russia, moving goods like amber, furs, wax, and timber, while evading the complex system of tolls and regulations imposed by various Baltic powers. Islands played a crucial role in medieval smuggling networks, serving as transshipment points, storage facilities, and jurisdictional havens. Their isolation and often ambiguous political status made them ideal bases for smuggling operations. Several island groups stand out as particularly important in the geography of medieval smuggling. The Channel Islands, situated between England and France, maintained a special constitutional relationship with the English crown while enjoying significant autonomy. This unique status, combined with their strategic location, made them perfect staging posts for smuggling operations in both directions across the Channel. Jersey and Guernsey, in particular, developed economies heavily dependent on facilitating trade, both licit and illicit, between England and continental Europe. The Isles of Scilly, located off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, served a similar function for smuggling operations in the western approaches to the English Channel. Their remote location and complex geography of small scattered islands made them extremely difficult to police effectively. Local inhabitants developed expertise in piloting vessels through the treacherous waters surrounding the islands, skills that proved valuable for both legitimate maritime activities and smuggling operations. In the Mediterranean, islands like Malta, Cyprus, and various Greek islands occupied strategic positions along major trade routes. Their position at the crossroads of different cultural and economic zones made them natural transshipment points where goods could be repackaged, relabeled, or otherwise disguised before continuing to their final destinations. The complex and shifting political control of these islands often created jurisdictional ambiguities that smugglers could exploit. While coastal and maritime routes dominated medieval smuggling, inland waterways also played significant roles in the movement of contraband goods. Major river systems like the Rhine, Danube, Seine, Thames, and Rhone served as arteries for both legitimate commerce and smuggling operations, connecting coastal regions with inland markets. River smuggling offered several advantages over land-based transport. Rivers allowed the movement of larger quantities of goods with less effort than overland routes, making them economically efficient. River traffic was also less conspicuous than land caravans, as commercial shipping was a normal feature of medieval riverine landscapes. Additionally, the jurisdictional complexity of many river systems, where different authorities might control opposite banks or different stretches of the same river, created opportunities for smugglers to exploit gaps in enforcement. The Rhine River system was particularly important for smuggling operations, connecting the North Sea with the interior of Germany and Switzerland. Goods that entered through Dutch ports could be moved upriver, crossing multiple jurisdictional boundaries and avoiding numerous toll stations designed to extract payments from legitimate traders. Similar patterns existed on other major European rivers, with smugglers developing intimate knowledge of where and how to bypass official checkpoints. Urban centers located on rivers often became smuggling hubs, where contraband could be integrated into legitimate commercial networks. Cities like Cologne, Paris, London, and Seville combined river access with large markets and complex urban landscapes that provided cover for illicit transactions. The warehouses, taverns, and markets of these cities offered numerous opportunities for smuggled goods to disappear into ordinary commerce. Land-based smuggling typically focused on border regions, where different taxation and regulatory regimes created profit opportunities. The effectiveness of medieval borders as barriers to smuggling varied enormously, depending on geographical features, political relationships, and enforcement capabilities. Mountain ranges like the Alps, Pyrenees, and Carpathians presented both challenges and opportunities for smugglers. While the difficult terrain made travel arduous, it also made comprehensive surveillance nearly impossible. Local guides familiar with mountain passes could lead smuggling expeditions through remote areas far from official border crossings. Alpine communities, in particular, developed economies partially dependent on facilitating trade, both legal and illegal, across the mountains, connecting Italian markets with those of France, Germany, and Switzerland. Forest regions similarly provided cover for smuggling operations. The extensive forests of medieval Europe, much more widespread than in modern times, offered concealment for the movement of contraband. The border forests between France and the Holy Roman Empire, or between various German principalities, became notorious for harboring smugglers who could disappear into the woods at the first sign of trouble. Some land borders were particularly porous due to political factors. The complex, frequently changing and often disputed borders between England and Scotland, or between various principalities in Germany and Italy, created zones of ambiguous jurisdiction where enforcement was difficult. Local populations in these border regions often developed cross-border identities and economic relationships that transcended official political divisions, facilitating smuggling networks that could rely on social connections spanning the formal border. Cities themselves became important nodes in smuggling networks, serving as markets for contraband, sources of capital for smuggling operations, and havens where smugglers could blend into the general population. The physical layout of medieval cities, with their narrow streets, crowded housing, and numerous warehouses, provided excellent opportunities for concealing illicit goods. Urban smuggling often focused on evading municipal taxes and regulations rather than national customs duties. Many cities imposed their own tolls on goods entering their gates, creating incentives to smuggle items into the city without passing through official checkpoints. The walls that surrounded most medieval cities were intended primarily for defense, but they also served as tax boundaries and consequently as challenges for smugglers to overcome. Smugglers developed various techniques for moving goods into cities without paying required duties. Some bribed gate guards or tax collectors. Others found weak points in city walls or used accomplices living in houses built into the walls to pass goods through windows or over rooftops. Some smuggling operations took place underground, utilizing ancient sewers, crypts, or purpose-built tunnels to move contraband beneath city walls. Within cities, certain neighborhoods often developed reputations as centers for dealing in smuggled goods. These might be districts near the waterfront in port cities, areas traditionally associated with foreign merchants, or simply poor neighborhoods where enforcement was less rigorous. Taverns, inns, and bathhouses served as meeting places where smuggling deals could be arranged under the guise of ordinary social activities. Rather than thinking of smuggling routes as fixed paths, it is more accurate to conceptualize them as flexible networks adapting to changing circumstances. Successful smuggling operations required the ability to shift routes in response to enforcement efforts, political changes, or market opportunities. The most sophisticated smuggling networks maintained multiple alternative routes, using different combinations depending on the specific goods being moved, the current enforcement environment, and seasonal factors like weather and agricultural cycles. These networks relied heavily on human capital, the knowledge, skills, and connections of individuals involved in smuggling operations. Local guides who knew hidden paths, boatmen familiar with treacherous waters, merchants with legitimate business connections that could provide cover, and corrupt officials willing to look the other way or provide information on enforcement activities were all essential components of effective smuggling networks. Information networks were as important as physical routes in medieval smuggling. Systems for gathering and transmitting intelligence about patrol schedules, policy changes, or market conditions could mean the difference between a successful smuggling operation and a disastrous interception. Taverns, markets, and religious festivals provided opportunities for seemingly casual conversations that actually served to exchange crucial information among smuggling network members. The geography of medieval smuggling was thus a complex, adaptive system that responded to both physical realities and human factors. Understanding these routes and networks provides insight into not just the mechanics of smuggling, but also the broader economic and political landscapes of medieval Europe, where official boundaries and regulations competed with unofficial networks and practices in shaping the movement of goods and people. The economic logic of smuggling in the medieval period was straightforward in principle, but complex in practice. At its core, smuggling was a rational economic response to market distortions created by taxation, regulation, and prohibition. When the gap between the taxed price of a good and its untaxed value exceeded the costs and risks associated with smuggling, illicit trade became economically attractive. This basic calculation drove the enormous underground economy that developed alongside official commercial channels throughout medieval Europe. The primary economic driver of smuggling was the existence of significant price differentials between regions or between legal and black markets within the same region. These differentials could arise from various sources. Taxation created the most common and predictable price gaps. When authorities imposed substantial customs duties, excise taxes, or other levies on goods, they artificially inflated prices in the legal market. For example, by the mid-14th century, English wool export duties had reached levels that effectively constituted a 30 to 40% tax on the value of the wool. This created an enormous incentive for smugglers, who could offer wool producers higher prices than legal exporters, while still selling the wool in Flanders at prices below those of legally exported wool. Prohibition created even more extreme price differentials. When goods were entirely banned rather than merely taxed, legal supply fell to zero while demand persisted, potentially driving black market prices to many times the production cost. While outright prohibitions were less common than taxation in the medieval period, they did exist for certain categories of goods, particularly during times of conflict or religious tension. Regional production differences naturally created price variations that smugglers could exploit. Goods produced efficiently in one region but not available in another would command premium prices in the latter. When these natural price differentials were exacerbated by political boundaries and associated taxes or restrictions, the incentives for smuggling multiplied. The profit margins available to smugglers varied widely depending on the goods involved, the specific taxes or prohibitions being evaded, and the costs and risks of particular smuggling routes. Some examples from historical sources provide insight into the scale of these margins. Tea, which became an increasingly important smuggled commodity in the later medieval and early modern periods, might cost 7 pence per pound on the continent, but sell for 5 shillings, 60 pence, in England, a markup of over 750%. Tobacco followed a similar pattern, costing 7 pence per pound in continental Europe, but fetching 2 shillings and 6 pence, 30 pence, in England, a markup of over 300%. Spirits like gin or brandy could be purchased for £1 per tub on the continent and sold for £4 in England before being diluted, with even higher profits possible after watering down the product. These enormous margins explain why smuggling persisted despite increasingly severe penalties. Even accounting for the costs of transport, bribes, protection, and the risk of confiscation or punishment, the potential profits made smuggling extremely attractive. The economics of smuggling involved balancing these potential profits against various costs and risks. Transportation costs could be substantial, particularly for bulky goods moved over difficult terrain or dangerous waters. Smugglers needed to pay for vessels, carts, pack animals, and the labor of those operating them. These costs were often higher per unit than for legitimate trade, as smugglers typically moved smaller quantities and used less efficient routes to avoid detection. Risk premiums constituted a major component of smuggling economics. Those directly involved in transporting contraband demanded compensation for the risks they took, which included potential imprisonment, physical punishment, or even death if caught. These risk premiums increased when enforcement became more effective or penalties more severe. Protection costs often involve payments to corrupt officials, local power holders, or armed guards. In some regions, smuggling operations functioned similarly to protection rackets, with regular payments made to local authorities to ensure they looked the other way. These payments could be formalized as bribes or disguised as legitimate business expenses, gifts, or charitable donations. Organizational costs included coordination, communication, and management of complex smuggling networks. As smuggling operations grew in scale and sophistication, they required individuals to serve as financiers, organizers, and intermediaries, all of whom expected compensation for their roles. The calculation of whether smuggling was economically viable involved comparing these costs and risks to the potential profits. This calculation varied significantly across different goods, routes, and time periods. High-value, low-bulk items like spices, silk, or precious metals could bear higher transportation costs and risk premiums while still yielding substantial profits. Bulkier commodities like wool or grain required more efficient smuggling operations with lower margins per unit, but potentially greater total profits due to volume. The financial structures supporting medieval smuggling operations ranged from simple to surprisingly sophisticated. At the lower end of the complexity spectrum, individual smugglers might finance their own small-scale operations, perhaps purchasing a few luxury items abroad and concealing them when returning home. At the other extreme, complex syndicates involving merchants, financiers, and local elites might pool substantial capital to finance large-scale smuggling ventures. Sources of capital for smuggling operations included merchant capital provided a significant portion of smuggling finance. Established merchants often diversified their activities across both legitimate and illicit trade, using profits from legal business to fund smuggling ventures that promised higher returns but carried greater risks. These merchants typically had the connections, knowledge, and infrastructure to organize effective smuggling operations. Cooperative financing became increasingly common as smuggling operations grew in scale and complexity. Groups of investors would pool resources to fund specific smuggling ventures, sharing both the risks and potential profits. These arrangements sometimes formalized into proto-corporate structures, with written agreements specifying investment shares and profit distribution methods. In Sussex and Kent, records indicate smuggling companies with dozens of shareholders by the later medieval period. Aristocratic patronage played a significant role in financing larger smuggling operations. Local nobles sometimes invested in smuggling as a means of augmenting their incomes, particularly during periods when traditional aristocratic revenue sources were under pressure. These elite sponsors provided not only capital but also political protection, making their involvement particularly valuable to smuggling networks. Credit mechanisms developed to support smuggling activities, paralleling the growth of commercial credit in the legitimate economy. Suppliers might provide goods on credit to smugglers to be paid for after the contraband was sold. Advance payments from buyers could fund procurement and transportation. More complex arrangements might involve bills of exchange or other financial instruments that were becoming common in medieval commercial practice. Once smuggled goods entered a region, they required distribution networks to reach end consumers. These networks varied in structure depending on the nature of the goods, the scale of operations, and local market conditions. Direct distribution characterized small-scale smuggling, with the smugglers themselves selling goods directly to consumers. This approach was common for high-value luxury items, where individual transactions might involve substantial sums and require trust between buyer and seller. Wholesale networks developed for larger-scale operations, with specialized smugglers supplying middlemen, who then distributed goods through various retail channels. These networks often mirrored legitimate distribution systems, with hierarchies of wholesalers, regional distributors, and local retailers. Integration with legitimate commerce was perhaps the most sophisticated approach. Smuggled goods might be laundered through legitimate businesses, gradually mixed with legal merchandise to disguise their origins. Innkeepers, shopkeepers, and merchants with established businesses provided ideal fronts for selling contraband, as they could explain the presence of goods and currency as part of their normal operations. Market information played a crucial role in the economics of smuggling. Successful smugglers needed accurate information about price differentials, enforcement activities, and consumer demand to make sound decisions about what to smuggle, when, and where. Information networks connected suppliers, transporters, distributors, and retailers, allowing the system to respond to changing market conditions and enforcement pressures. The economic impact of smuggling extended far beyond the direct participants in illicit trade. Smuggling created various market distortions and spillover effects that influenced broader economic patterns. Revenue loss for authorities represented the most obvious economic impact. The scale of this loss could be substantial. By some estimates, the English crown lost up to 50% of potential customs revenue to smuggling during certain periods of the 14th century. These revenue shortfalls could force authorities to increase tax rates on other goods or activities, potentially creating new incentives for tax evasion in a self-reinforcing cycle. Price effects in consumer markets were significant. Smuggling tended to increase the supply of heavily taxed goods, driving down their market prices below what would prevail if all trade occurred through legal channels. This benefited consumers, but undermined the intended effects of taxation policies, whether those policies aimed at revenue generation or consumption control. Competitive distortions affected legitimate merchants who found themselves unable to compete with smugglers offering similar goods at lower prices. This could drive honest traders out of certain markets or pressure them to engage in smuggling themselves to remain competitive. Over time, entire sectors of regional economies could become dependent on illicit trade, creating powerful vested interests opposed to effective enforcement. Resource allocation was affected as smuggling diverted labor, capital, and entrepreneurial talent from productive activities toward the essentially redistributive activity of tax evasion. While smuggling might increase allocative efficiency by circumventing distortionary taxes, it also consumed real resources in the cat-and-mouse game between smugglers and authorities. The economics of medieval smuggling reveals a complex underground system that responded rationally to incentives created by taxation, regulation, and market conditions. This system developed its own specialized roles, financing mechanisms, risk management strategies, and distribution networks, paralleling and often intertwining with legitimate commerce. Understanding the economic logic that drove this system helps explain both its persistence in the face of increasingly severe enforcement efforts and its profound influence on the development of the medieval economy. The practical methods employed by medieval smugglers demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and adaptability. These techniques evolved in response to changing enforcement strategies, technological developments, and shifting patterns of trade and taxation. While smuggling operations varied widely across regions and time periods, certain common approaches emerged throughout medieval Europe. The most basic smuggling method involved simply hiding contraband to avoid detection during transportation or storage. Medieval smugglers developed numerous concealment techniques adapted to specific goods and contexts. False compartments in ships became increasingly sophisticated as naval architecture advanced throughout the medieval period. Secret spaces might be built into a vessel's structure during construction or added later, often in locations difficult for customs searchers to access. Double hulls, false bulkheads, and modified cargo holds could conceal substantial quantities of contraband beneath seemingly legitimate cargoes. Modified vehicles and containers on land served similar functions. False bottoms in carts, hollow axles, and specially designed saddle packs allowed smugglers to transport contraband past checkpoints under the guise of ordinary commercial or personal travel. One recovered 14th century cart from the Anglo-Scottish border region revealed an ingeniously designed false compartment beneath the driver's seat, large enough to conceal several pounds of high-value goods like spices or silk. Personal concealment methods relied on clothing and bodily hiding places. Specially designed garments with hidden pockets or compartments allowed individuals to carry small but valuable items across borders. Women's clothing, with its multiple layers and voluminous designs, proved particularly effective for concealing contraband, a fact not lost on medieval authorities, who sometimes employed female searchers specifically to examine women suspected of smuggling. Disguising goods as something else represented another common approach. Smugglers might repackage contraband to resemble legitimate merchandise, falsify labels or markings, or physically alter goods to change their appearance. Wine might be transported in containers marked as olive oil. Fine silks might be roughly wrapped to appear as common cloth, or luxury spices might be mixed with similar-looking but less valuable substances. Strategic timing played a crucial role in successful smuggling operations. Nocturnal operations were standard practice, with darkness providing essential cover for landing goods on beaches, crossing borders at unofficial points, or moving contraband through towns. The term owling, used to describe wool smuggling from England to France, specifically referenced the nighttime nature of these activities. Many coastal communities had local names for beaches or coves that served as nighttime landing spots, often incorporating elements like moon or dark in their designations. Weather conditions significantly influenced smuggling activities. Fog, storms, and heavy rain reduced visibility and drove customs officers to seek shelter, creating opportunities for smugglers willing to brave the elements. Winter conditions might freeze rivers or marshes that normally served as natural barriers, opening new smuggling routes temporarily. Conversely, severe weather could make certain smuggling routes impassable, forcing operations to adapt seasonally. Festival periods and religious holidays often coincided with reduced customs vigilance, as officials participated in celebrations or simply expected less commercial activity during these times. Records from medieval Southampton show clear patterns of increased seizures of contraband immediately following major religious festivals, suggesting that smugglers specifically targeted these periods for their operations. The fragmented political landscape of medieval Europe created numerous opportunities for smugglers to exploit gaps and overlaps in jurisdiction. Border anomalies and enclaves provided ideal conditions for smuggling. Territories completely surrounded by another jurisdiction, or complex boundaries where territory alternated between different authorities, created enforcement nightmares that smugglers readily exploited. The complex border regions between England and Scotland, or the patchwork of ecclesiastical and secular territories in parts of Germany and Italy, became notorious smuggling hotspots. Disputed territories where multiple authorities claimed jurisdiction created particular opportunities, as enforcement responsibilities remained unclear. Smugglers operating in these areas could claim to have paid duties to whichever authority was not currently questioning them, making verification difficult in an era before standardized documentation and rapid communication. Strategic use of sanctuaries and privileged places further complicated enforcement. Churches, monasteries, and certain chartered towns enjoyed special legal privileges that limited the authority of royal or princely officials within their boundaries. Smugglers would move contraband into these protected areas, where it could be stored or sold with reduced risk of seizure. By the late medieval period, some religious establishments, particularly those near coastlines or borders, had developed reputations as de facto smuggling depots. As medieval commercial regulation grew more sophisticated, so too did the methods smugglers used to circumvent documentary requirements. Forged customs documents became increasingly common as authorities required more paperwork to accompany legitimate shipments. Counterfeit seals, falsified certificates, and fraudulent cargo manifests allowed contraband to masquerade as duty-paid merchandise. In England, the discovery of a counterfeit customs seal in Southampton in 1428 led to a major investigation that implicated numerous local merchants in a sophisticated documentation fraud scheme operating for over a decade. Misrepresentation of origins or destinations allowed merchants to take advantage of preferential tax treatments or bypass embargoes. Goods from a heavily taxed source might be transported first to an intermediate location, then reshipped with documentation claiming that location as the origin. Similarly, goods bound for prohibited destinations might be documented for legitimate ports, then diverted once at sea. Under-declaration of quantities or values represented perhaps the most common documentation fraud. Merchants might accurately declare the type of goods being shipped, but significantly understate the amount or quality, thereby reducing their tax liability. This approach had the advantage of providing some documentation to show authorities if questioned, while still allowing substantial tax evasion. Perhaps the most effective smuggling method involved corrupting the very officials charged with preventing illicit trade. Bribery of customs officers was widespread throughout medieval Europe. The relatively low salaries of most customs officials made them susceptible to financial inducements, while their positions gave them perfect information about patrol schedules, inspection procedures, and enforcement priorities. In some ports, bribery became so institutionalized that it effectively functioned as an unofficial but predictable tax, with standard rates for allowing different types of contraband to pass uninspected. Collusion with local authorities extended beyond simple bribery. Local officials often had economic interests aligned with their communities, rather than with distant central governments. Mayors, sheriffs, and other local power holders might actively participate in smuggling operations, providing protection, information, and sometimes direct assistance in moving contraband. When these local officials were also responsible for appointing or supervising customs officers, the conflicts of interest became even more pronounced. Infiltration of enforcement organizations represented the most sophisticated form of corruption. Smuggling networks would arrange for their members or associates to obtain positions within customs services, providing inside information and direct assistance. Alternatively, existing officials might be gradually drawn into smuggling networks through a progression from small favors to active participation. The difficulty of supervising dispersed enforcement personnel made this infiltration particularly hard to prevent. When other methods failed, smugglers sometimes resorted to force to protect their operations. Armed convoys became common for high-value smuggling operations, particularly in regions where enforcement efforts were aggressive. Groups of armed men would escort contraband shipments, prepared to resist any attempt at interdiction. The scale of these armed groups could be substantial. Records from 15th century Kent describe smuggling convoys with over 50 armed men protecting wool shipments bound for unauthorized coastal loading points. Intimidation of officials and informants served both immediate and deterrent purposes. Customs officers who could not be bribed might be threatened, while potential informants were warned of severe consequences for cooperation with authorities. These threats carried particular weight in small communities where officials lived among the people they policed and where everyone knew one another. Organized violence occasionally erupted when preventive measures failed through other means. Some coastal regions developed reputations for the ferocity with which local smuggling interests would defend their operations. The Romney Marsh area of Kent became particularly notorious, with armed gangs of smugglers openly challenging royal authority by the late medieval period. Records from 1416 describe a pitched battle between customs officers and armed smugglers on the Sussex coast, resulting in multiple fatalities on both sides. Smugglers continuously adapted their methods in response to technological developments and enforcement innovations. Vessel design evolved specifically to support smuggling activities. Fast, shallow draft boats that could navigate coastal waters inaccessible to larger patrol vessels became essential tools for maritime smugglers. By the 15th century, specialized smuggling vessels operated along the English Channel, optimized for speed, maneuverability, and the ability to beach directly on shores without requiring port facilities. Signaling systems developed to coordinate smuggling operations and warn of approaching authorities. Coastal communities established networks of lookouts and signal points, using fire, flags, or other visual signals visible from sea to indicate whether landing conditions were safe. These systems grew increasingly sophisticated over time, eventually incorporating codes that could communicate specific information about the type and location of enforcement activity. Storage innovations allowed contraband to be concealed more effectively during transit and while awaiting distribution. Waterproof containers for landing goods from boats to beaches, concealed underground storage chambers, and specialized packaging designed to resist damage during rough handling all improved the efficiency and security of smuggling operations. The methods employed by medieval smugglers reflected a continuous process of adaptation and innovation in response to changing enforcement strategies and commercial regulations. The sophistication of these methods indicates the significant resources dedicated to evading customs controls and the economic importance of smuggling within medieval commerce. Rather than representing a marginal criminal activity, smuggling operated as a parallel commercial system with its own specialized techniques, organizational structures, and technological developments. The individuals who engaged in medieval smuggling came from remarkably diverse backgrounds, challenging any simplistic characterization of smugglers as a homogeneous criminal class. Smuggling attracted participants from across the social spectrum, from the humblest fishermen to wealthy merchants and even members of the nobility. This section explores the varied profiles of those who participated in the shadow economy of medieval smuggling. Established merchants constituted perhaps the most significant category of smugglers in medieval Europe. Their legitimate commercial activities provided both cover and infrastructure for smuggling operations. International traders with connections across multiple jurisdictions were ideally positioned to exploit differences in taxation and regulation. Italian merchants operating in England, for instance, were frequently implicated in smuggling wool, cloth, and precious metals. Their established commercial networks, access to shipping, and familiarity with cross-border financial transactions made smuggling a natural extension of their legitimate activities. Guild merchants, despite their formal association with regulated trade, often engaged in smuggling to increase profit margins or circumvent restrictions on commercial activities. Guild records from 15th century London reveal numerous cases of members prosecuted for evading wool customs or importing contraband luxury goods. The very status that made these merchants respectable citizens also provided cover for their illicit activities, as their positions above suspicion reduced the likelihood of rigorous inspection. Merchant smugglers typically operated with greater sophistication and at larger scales than other smuggling participants. They could finance major operations, maintain complex documentation to conceal their activities, and leverage business relationships with officials and other merchants to facilitate their smuggling ventures. The case of Richard Lyons, a London merchant impeached in the Good Parliament of 1376, illustrates this pattern. Lyons used his position as a royal customs farmer to organize large-scale wool smuggling, while simultaneously collecting customs duties on behalf of the crown. Coastal populations provided both the labor force and local expertise essential for maritime smuggling. Fishermen played crucial roles in smuggling operations due to their intimate knowledge of local waters, ownership of suitable vessels, and legitimate reasons to be at sea at all hours. Fishing communities along the English Channel, North Sea, and Mediterranean coasts developed dual economies, with fishing and smuggling providing complementary income sources. During seasons when fishing was poor or dangerous, smuggling activities often increased correspondingly. Sailors from commercial vessels supplemented their meager wages by participating in smuggling, either by concealing small quantities of high-value goods among their personal effects, or by cooperating with larger smuggling operations during port calls. The mobility of sailors made them valuable participants in smuggling networks, as they could serve as couriers and information carriers between different ports. Harbor workers, stevedores, warehousemen, boat repairers, and others who worked around ports facilitated smuggling by providing access to port facilities, advance information about inspections, and practical assistance in moving contraband. Their presence in port areas attracted little attention, allowing them to serve as lookouts, intermediaries, and sometimes as smugglers themselves. For many maritime communities, smuggling represented not simply criminal activity, but a necessary economic adaptation to harsh living conditions and limited legitimate opportunities. Contemporary accounts sometimes note that coastal villages experienced suspicious prosperity despite poor fishing seasons, reflecting the economic importance of smuggling to these communities. Agricultural communities, particularly those producing goods subject to heavy taxation or export restrictions, often participated directly in smuggling networks. Wool producers in England had strong economic incentives to cooperate with smugglers, who typically offered prices 15 to 30% higher than those available through legitimate channels due to the heavy export duties on wool. Large-scale sheep farmers might organize their own smuggling operations, while smaller producers would sell to intermediaries known to supply smuggling networks. The concentration of sheep farming in regions like the Cotswolds, Yorkshire, and the Scottish borders created natural centers for wool smuggling activity. Winemakers in regions like Gascony, Burgundy, and the Rhineland similarly found smuggling networks attractive as buyers, particularly when duties, war, or political restrictions disrupted normal trade patterns. The seasonal nature of wine production created annual surges in smuggling activity around harvest time, when newly produced wine needed to reach markets. Grain producers turned to smuggling during periods when export prohibitions were imposed during food shortages. While authorities might ban grain exports to ensure domestic food security, price differentials between regions experiencing different harvest conditions created powerful incentives for illicit grain shipments. This type of smuggling was particularly common across the English Channel and North Sea, where short maritime journeys could connect regions with significantly different grain prices. For many rural producers, the line between legitimate trade and smuggling blurred considerably. A sheep farmer selling wool to a merchant might reasonably claim ignorance of whether that wool would eventually be exported legally or smuggled. This ambiguity provided a degree of plausible deniability that protected producers from the harshest penalties for smuggling. Elite participation in smuggling operations revealed the complex relationship between official authority and illicit economic activity in medieval society. Coastal lords, particularly those holding lands with extensive shorelines or strategic harbors, often protected or directly organized smuggling operations within their territories. The economic benefits could be substantial. A share of smuggling profits, increased economic activity among tenants, and enhanced local loyalty. Lords might maintain private harbors ostensibly for fishing or local trade, but actually optimized for smuggling operations. Archaeological evidence from manor houses near the English coast sometimes reveals specialized storage facilities oriented toward harbors rather than inland transportation routes, suggesting integration with maritime smuggling. Border nobility in regions like the Anglo-Scottish Marches developed sophisticated cross-border smuggling operations, protected by their military power and political connections. These nobles might simultaneously hold positions enforcing border security while facilitating the very smuggling they were officially tasked with preventing. Their castles and fortified manors served dual purposes as defensive structures and secure depots for contraband. Court connections provided protection for smuggling operations organized or sponsored by nobles with influence in royal or princely circles. High-ranking nobles could sometimes secure tacit immunity from enforcement actions or obtain official exemptions that could be exploited for smuggling purposes. The case of John Holland, Duke of Exeter and half-brother to King Richard II, illustrates this pattern. Holland used his court connections to protect a major wool smuggling operation from his estates in East Anglia to the Low Countries in the 1390s. For the nobility, smuggling often represented not merely economic opportunity, but also an assertion of local autonomy against centralizing royal power. By protecting or participating in smuggling, local elites demonstrated their effective control over their territories regardless of royal regulations. Various specialized roles emerged within urban centers to facilitate the storage, processing, and distribution of smuggled goods. Innkeepers occupied crucial positions in smuggling networks due to their legitimate reasons for receiving guests, handling goods, and conducting financial transactions. Inns served as meeting places for arranging smuggling deals, temporary storage facilities for contraband, and retail outlets for smuggled goods. The mobility of travelers provided cover for the movement of both smugglers and contraband, while the semi-public nature of inns allowed different participants in smuggling networks to meet without attracting undue attention. Craftsmen who processed raw materials often served as intermediaries in smuggling chains. Goldsmiths might purchase smuggled bullion, weavers might buy smuggled wool or silk, and brewers might obtain smuggled grain or hops. These artisans could integrate contraband into their legitimate production processes, effectively laundering illegal imports into legal finished products. Money changers and early bankers facilitated the financial aspects of smuggling operations, handling the substantial sums involved while maintaining plausible deniability about the sources of funds. They provided mechanisms for transferring value across jurisdictional boundaries without physical currency movement, reducing the risks associated with carrying large amounts of cash. By the late medieval period, sophisticated financial instruments like bills of exchange allowed smugglers to conduct substantial transactions with minimal documentation that could be traced back to specific smuggling operations. As medieval smuggling grew more sophisticated, individuals emerged who specialized entirely in illicit trade. Borderland guides developed expert knowledge of unguarded crossing points, patrol schedules, and safe routes through difficult terrain. These individuals might present themselves as hunters, shepherds, or travelers, while actually generating their primary income from guiding smuggling expeditions across borders. Their intimate familiarity with local geography made them invaluable to smuggling operations, particularly in mountainous or heavily forested border regions. Coastal pilots specialized in navigating treacherous waters to reach isolated landing spots suitable for unloading contraband. Their knowledge of tides, currents, submerged hazards, and sheltered coves allowed smuggling vessels to operate in areas inaccessible to customs patrols. These skills were particularly valuable in regions with dangerous coastlines like Cornwall, Brittany, or parts of the Mediterranean, where navigation required local expertise. Armed escorts emerged as enforcement efforts intensified, providing protection for valuable smuggling shipments. These individuals, often former soldiers or members of local militia groups, represented the most overtly criminalized aspect of smuggling operations. They might be hired temporarily for specific smuggling runs or maintained as permanent security forces by larger smuggling organizations. The role of women in medieval smuggling has been historically underappreciated, but was actually quite significant. Female traders operating at the small-scale retail level often sold smuggled goods in markets and shops. Their participation in legitimate commerce provided cover for dealing in contraband, while gender expectations sometimes reduced their likelihood of being searched or questioned by authorities. Coastal women managed local smuggling operations, while male family members were at sea. Court records occasionally reveal cases where women coordinated complex smuggling activities, arranged financing, managed storage facilities, and negotiated with buyers and suppliers. The tendency of authorities to focus enforcement efforts on male suspects sometimes allowed these female smuggling managers to operate with reduced scrutiny. Clothing concealment particularly leveraged gender expectations, as women's more voluminous garments of the period provided excellent hiding places for small, valuable contraband items. Customs records document cases of women caught with remarkable quantities of smuggled spices, jewelry, or coin concealed in specially adapted clothing. By the late medieval period, Some customs points had specifically employed female searchers to address this technique. The diversity of individuals involved in medieval smuggling demonstrates that it was not a marginal criminal activity, but rather an integral aspect of the medieval economy that crossed social boundaries and integrated with legitimate commerce at multiple levels. From peasants to peers, the allure of smuggling's profits and the practical necessities of economic survival drew participants from throughout medieval society. Medieval smuggling operations ranged from simple opportunistic ventures by individuals to complex organizations with specialized roles, hierarchical structures, and sophisticated management systems. The social organization of smuggling reflected both the scale of operations and regional variations in economic conditions, enforcement pressures, and cultural attitudes toward illicit trade. At the simplest level, individual travelers and merchants engaged in opportunistic smuggling by concealing small quantities of goods to avoid duties. Individual concealment typically involved travelers hiding small quantities of valuable goods among their personal effects when crossing borders or entering towns. This form of smuggling required minimal organization, often representing spontaneous decisions rather than planned operations. A merchant returning from a fair might hide a few luxury items to avoid town tolls, or a pilgrim might conceal spices purchased abroad to avoid import duties. Family-based operations represented a step up in organizational complexity. Family units might coordinate simple smuggling activities, with different members handling acquisition, transportation, concealment, and sales. These family operations often emerged from legitimate economic activities. A fishing family might occasionally use their boat for smuggling runs, or a farming family near a border might supplement their income by moving goods across that border through their lands. Local cooperation among neighbors often facilitated small-scale smuggling in communities where economic pressures were widely shared. Residents of coastal villages might collectively unload smuggled cargoes at night, with the entire community participating and maintaining silence when authorities investigated. This type of community-based smuggling relied on shared economic interests and strong social bonds, rather than formal organizational structures. As the scale and profitability of smuggling increased, more formalized organizational structures emerged. Hierarchical networks developed with clear leadership, specialized roles, and defined responsibilities. These organizations might be centered around a prominent merchant, a powerful local noble, or a particularly skilled smuggling entrepreneur. Leadership typically controlled financing, maintained connections with suppliers and buyers, and coordinated overall operations, while delegating specific tasks to subordinates. Role specialization became increasingly pronounced in larger smuggling organizations. Distinct roles emerged for individuals who sourced goods, arranged transportation, managed storage, handled bribes and protection, maintained lookouts and intelligence networks, and distributed contraband to retail markets. This specialization allowed for greater efficiency and security, as individual participants needed to know only those aspects of the operation directly relevant to their roles. Territorial organization characterized some regional smuggling networks, with different groups controlling specific routes, landing sites, or market areas. These territorial arrangements might be enforced through violence or negotiated through agreements to reduce competition and attention from authorities. In some regions, particularly along the English Channel, evidence suggests that smuggling groups effectively divided coastlines into operational zones, with understood boundaries and occasional coordination for larger operations. The most sophisticated smuggling operations were integrated with legitimate business activities, creating hybrid enterprises that could shift seamlessly between legal and illegal trade. Merchant houses engaged in both legitimate and illicit trade, using the same vessels, warehouses, and commercial networks for both purposes. These enterprises maintained proper documentation and paid duties on some shipments, while concealing others entirely or understating quantities and values. The legitimate aspects of their operations provided cover for smuggling activities and made it difficult for authorities to distinguish between legal and illegal shipments. Commercial infiltration strategies involved placing smuggling operatives within legitimate commercial facilities like warehouses, customs houses, and transportation companies. These insiders could facilitate smuggling by misdirecting inspections, falsifying documents, or providing access to secure areas. A well-placed warehouse clerk, for instance, might ensure that contraband was stored in areas unlikely to be inspected or mixed with legitimate goods in ways that obscured its nature. Financial integration between legitimate and smuggling operations allowed for the laundering of proceeds and the disguising of smuggling investments as normal business activities. Profits from smuggling might be recorded as legitimate commercial gains, while investments in smuggling ventures could be hidden within ordinary business expenditures. This financial integration made it extremely difficult for authorities to trace the money flows associated with smuggling activities. Smuggling operations that crossed political boundaries required particularly sophisticated organizational structures to coordinate activities across different jurisdictions. Binational partnerships emerged between merchants or smugglers on opposite sides of borders or across maritime routes. These partnerships allowed each party to operate primarily within their own jurisdiction while coordinating with partners abroad. A wool merchant in England might arrange for wool to be transported to an isolated beach, while a partner in Flanders would organize the vessel to collect it and the distribution network to sell it once landed. Information networks spanning multiple jurisdictions provided crucial intelligence about market conditions, enforcement activities, and political developments that might affect smuggling operations. These networks relied on travelers, merchants, sailors, and specifically designated couriers to carry information across borders. By the late medieval period, some sophisticated smuggling operations maintained regular information exchanges using coded messages carried by seemingly ordinary travelers or commercial correspondents. Cultural and linguistic bridges were essential for cross-border smuggling networks operating in regions with different languages and customs. Individuals who straddled cultural boundaries, whether through family connections, education, or commercial experience, played key roles in facilitating communication and trust within these networks. In border regions where local populations often shared cultural and linguistic traits despite political divisions, these connections were particularly strong and difficult for central authorities to penetrate. Successful smuggling operations, particularly those operating at larger scales, required systematic arrangements for protection from enforcement. Official protection networks involved regular payments to officials at various levels in exchange for non-enforcement or advance warning of enforcement activities. These arrangements might begin with low-level customs officers, but could extend to local magistrates, sheriffs, and sometimes even higher officials. The predictability of these protection arrangements was crucial for smuggling operations, allowing them to calculate the costs of protection as a regular business expense. Noble patronage provided particularly effective protection for smuggling operations. Local nobles might shield smuggling activities within their territories in exchange for a share of profits or other considerations. This protection could be especially valuable when the noble held official positions related to law enforcement or border security, creating an insurmountable conflict of interest for effective customs enforcement. Intimidation systems developed to discourage informants and maintain community silence about smuggling activities. These systems ranged from social ostracism for those who cooperated with authorities to explicit threats and occasional violence against informants. The effectiveness of these intimidation networks contributed significantly to the difficulty authorities faced in gathering intelligence about smuggling operations. Many smuggling operations demonstrated remarkable adaptability, changing their organizational structures in response to seasonal factors, enforcement pressures, and market opportunities. Seasonal shifts in personnel and routes occurred in response to agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and enforcement variations. During harvest seasons, agricultural workers might temporarily join smuggling operations, while fishing vessels might engage in smuggling during winter months when fishing was less productive. These seasonal patterns created fluid organizational structures that expanded and contracted according to conditions. Responsive reorganization following enforcement successes represented a key survival strategy for smuggling networks. When authorities managed to disrupt smuggling operations through arrests or seizures, the remaining participants would quickly reorganize, developing new routes, methods, and organizational structures. This adaptability made it extraordinarily difficult for medieval authorities to permanently suppress smuggling activities. Market-responsive organization allowed smuggling networks to quickly shift focus to different commodities in response to changing tax rates, prohibition policies, or market demands. The organizational knowledge and connections developed for smuggling one type of good could be readily applied to others when economic conditions changed, allowing smuggling networks to persist even as specific smuggling opportunities evolved. The social organization of smuggling was supported by cultural factors that facilitated trust, communication, and collective action among participants. Kinship networks provided foundations of trust, crucial for illicit operations, where legal recourse was unavailable. Extended family connections often formed the core of smuggling organizations, with blood relationships reducing the risks of betrayal and facilitating the recruitment of new participants as operations expanded. Court records frequently reveal multiple members of the same extended families implicated in smuggling cases. Occupational solidarities created bonds among individuals engaged in the same trades, particularly maritime occupations like fishing and shipping. These solidarities, often formalized through guilds or informal associations, could be leveraged for smuggling activities. The shared skills, knowledge, and experiences of occupational groups provided both the practical capabilities and the trust relationships necessary for effective smuggling operations. Regional identities sometimes supported smuggling as a form of resistance against external impositions. In regions where customs duties were perceived as unfair extractions by distant authorities, smuggling could become integrated into expressions of regional autonomy or identity. This cultural dimension made participation in smuggling not merely an economic choice, but also an affirmation of community solidarity against outside control. The social organization of medieval smuggling thus ranged from simple individual activities to complex, adaptive networks spanning multiple jurisdictions and integrating with legitimate commerce. These organizational structures evolved in response to economic opportunities, enforcement pressures, and cultural contexts, demonstrating the remarkable resilience and adaptability that allowed smuggling to persist despite increasingly sophisticated efforts to suppress it. The role of women in medieval smuggling has been significantly underrepresented in traditional historical accounts, which have often focused on the more visible male participants in illicit trade. However, recent scholarship has revealed that women played diverse and crucial roles in smuggling operations, contributing to all aspects of these illicit economic activities. This section explores the varied ways in which women participated in and sometimes led smuggling enterprises during the medieval period. Women participated directly in smuggling operations in various capacities, leveraging both gender expectations and their positions within medieval economic structures. Couriers and transporters of contraband utilized expectations about women's mobility and activities to avoid suspicion. Women traveling to markets, visiting family, or making pilgrimages could transport small quantities of valuable contraband with reduced risk of search or questioning. Court records from 15th century England document cases of women caught carrying smuggled spices, jewelry, and coin, concealed in baskets of ordinary market goods or sewn into their clothing. Coastal operations frequently involved women who coordinated the landing and distribution of smuggled goods. While fishing boats, typically operated by men, might bring contraband to shore, women from fishing communities would often manage the onshore aspects of smuggling operations. They organized transportation from beaches to storage locations, coordinated with local buyers, and maintained lookout systems to warn of approaching authorities. Urban distribution networks often relied heavily on female participants. Women who operated as market vendors, shopkeepers, or tavern keepers could integrate smuggled goods into their legitimate business activities with minimal suspicion. Their established presence in local markets provided perfect cover for selling contraband alongside legal merchandise. Municipal court records from towns like Bristol, Southampton, and London contain numerous cases of women prosecuted for selling smuggled wine, spices, or textiles in their shops and market stalls. Beyond direct operational roles, women sometimes occupied leadership positions within smuggling organizations. Business management became a female domain in some smuggling operations, particularly when male family members were frequently absent due to maritime activities or had been imprisoned or killed as a result of smuggling activities. Women in these circumstances might assume control of family smuggling enterprises, managing finances, negotiating with suppliers and buyers, and coordinating operations. The prevalence of widows among those prosecuted for organizing smuggling activities suggests that women often continued and sometimes expanded smuggling operations after the deaths of husbands who had previously led these enterprises. Financial backing for smuggling ventures occasionally came from wealthy women who had inheritance or dowry resources to invest. While medieval women faced significant legal and social restrictions on their economic activities, some widows and independent women of means found smuggling investments attractive due to their high returns. Guild records and court cases sometimes reveal women as silent partners in smuggling operations, providing capital while remaining distanced from day-to-day activities. Property owners with strategically located lands or buildings sometimes facilitated smuggling by providing storage facilities or access points. Female landowners, particularly widows who had inherited coastal properties or buildings near city walls, could generate significant income by allowing these properties to be used for smuggling purposes. The will of Agnes Paston from 15th century Norfolk reveals her ownership of several coastal properties that local records suggest were regularly used for wool smuggling operations. Women engaged in smuggling benefited from certain gendered assumptions that created both opportunities and protections. Reduced suspicion from authorities gave women significant advantages in certain smuggling contexts. Officials were often reluctant to subject women, particularly those of higher social status, to thorough searches or questioning. This reluctance reflected both cultural notions of propriety and practical limitations. Many customs posts had no female officials available to search women. Court records indicate that smuggling operations sometimes deliberately employed women as couriers, specifically because of this reduced scrutiny. Lighter punishments typically awaited women caught smuggling compared to their male counterparts. Medieval justice systems often treated female offenders with greater leniency, particularly in cases involving economic crimes rather than violence. While men convicted of major smuggling offenses might face imprisonment, substantial fines, or even execution in extreme cases, women were more likely to receive token fines or brief periods of detention. This gendered disparity in punishment created a practical calculation within smuggling organizations about who should take greater risks. Social invisibility of certain categories of women in medieval society created opportunities for smuggling activities to occur unnoticed. Servants, washerwomen, market vendors, and other women of lower social status could move through public spaces without attracting attention, making them effective agents for smuggling operations. Their legitimate reasons for carrying bundles, baskets, or containers provided perfect cover for transporting contraband through towns or across borders. The participation of women in smuggling existed within complex cultural contexts that both constrained and enabled their activities. Family-based smuggling enterprises were common in medieval coastal communities, with entire families participating in different aspects of operations. Within these family structures, women often managed household aspects of smuggling, receiving, concealing, and preparing contraband for sale, while men handled maritime transportation. This gendered division of labor reflected broader patterns in medieval household economies, while integrating smuggling into family economic strategies. Literary and folkloric representations of female smugglers reveal cultural ambivalence about women's participation in illicit economic activities. While official documents consistently condemned smuggling, popular ballads and stories sometimes celebrated clever female smugglers who outwitted authorities. These cultural representations suggest that communities might admire the ingenuity and economic pragmatism of women who successfully navigate the dangerous waters of illicit trade to support their families and communities. Religious contexts occasionally provided cover for women's smuggling activities. Nuns and female religious communities engaged in economic activities that could conceal smuggling operations, while pilgrimage routes created opportunities for women to transport contraband under the guise of religious travel. The religious exemption sometimes granted to female religious houses from certain taxes and inspections created potential spaces for evading customs controls. Specific historical cases illuminate the diverse ways women participated in medieval smuggling. Marjorie Cobb of Dover appears in English customs records from the 1420s as a persistent organizer of wool smuggling operations. Court documents describe her coordinating the collection of wool from producers across Kent, arranging for its transportation to coastal loading points, and negotiating with boat owners to carry the wool to Calais. Despite being fined multiple times, Cobb continued her operations for over a decade, suggesting both the profitability of her enterprise and her skill in managing complex smuggling logistics. The fishwives of Folkestone became notorious in the late 14th century for their systematic smuggling of wine and spirits. Using their legitimate fish-selling activities as cover, These women transported smuggled French wine inland from coastal landing points, distributing it through networks of taverns and private homes across southeastern England. Their operation was eventually disrupted when a competing smuggling group informed authorities, highlighting the complex relationships between different smuggling organizations. Alice Pollard of Bristol, described in court records as a respectable widow, was convicted in 1418 of operating a sophisticated smuggling operation that moved cloth and wool to Brittany while importing wine and salt without paying customs duties. The case revealed her control of multiple vessels, employment of numerous agents, and maintenance of detailed accounting records, suggesting a substantial business operation rather than small-scale evasion. Her eventual punishment was notably mild, a fine representing only a small portion of the estimated duties evaded, reflecting the gendered nature of medieval justice.